Hi friends, this is my third annual horror movie education vlog. As somebody who grew up in a conservative evangelical home, I was not allowed to watch horror movies. They were seen as really scary, as demonic, and part of my deconstruction journey as an adult has been starting to watch horror movies that I didn't see back in the day and movies that I never would have seen. It's been surprisingly cathartic and surprisingly helpful as well to let go of some of the fear that I held on to for a long time. All of that to say, a couple of years ago, I started doing this video project where every October I pick 5 horror movies that I've never seen, watch them for the first time, and document my reactions. If you are interested in seeing the last 2 years of movies that I watched and reacted to for the first time, I will link that playlist for you. But for 2022's project, I've selected 5 movies ranging from the 1990s to 2022, and we're going to watch them in chronological order, which I think might be particularly interesting with some of the choices I've made to compare and contrast generational differences in movies. So here are the movies that I'm going to be watching for the 2022 horror movie project. Beginning in 1996 with a classic, we have Scream. This is a teen slasher film that was the first to do quite a few things like being self-aware, self-referential. It's an interesting one. It's the first one that I've watched. I saw it last night. I'm going to give you my thoughts on it, but first let's talk about the rest of the movies that I'm going to be watching and discussing for the month of October. I anticipate putting this video up on Halloween. For 2009, we have the film Jennifer's Body. This is a film that I wasn't aware of until I started watching Jay Stoobs over on TikTok. She talks about movies, media, and comics, and I really like her a lot. She is queer and feminist, and Jennifer's Body is her favorite horror movie. She talks about it as a feminist, bisexual teen horror film that I'm really interested in seeing, and it has Amanda Seyfried, who I really like. And in fact, she is also in our next film, which came out in 2010. This one is Chloe. It's got an excellent cast lineup: Amanda Seyfried, Julianne Moore, and Liam Neeson in this bisexual domestic thriller horror thing. Also, I hadn't realized it until I sat down and put this together, but it's interesting that Amanda Seyfried was in 2 kind of bisexual roles in horror movies back to back. I don't know what that is, but this one looks pretty interesting. Then moving all the way up to 2019, I'm gonna watch Midsommar. This is an indie horror film that is kind of culty, set in Sweden. It looks weird, it looks interesting, and I've been meaning to see it for a while. And then lastly, we're going to watch a 2022 film. This is Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. I'm particularly interested in this one because I've heard it talked about as sort of the Gen Z teen slasher film as opposed to Scream, which is more of the original Gen X slasher film, and I think comparing and contrasting some of those generational differences in this video could be really interesting. Those are the 5 horror movies I've selected to watch in 2022. Let's go ahead and get started by talking about Scream. Like I said, Scream came out in 1996. I am a late 80s baby, so I was only 9 years old when Scream came out, and while it was popular with my generation, the audience that it was really targeting and I think talking about, because these kinds of horror movies are often talking about the fears and issues of the day, was Gen X teenagers. That's who it would have been primarily targeted at, which is particularly interesting when you take a look at some of the issues that are raised in this movie. And heads up, there will be spoilers for Scream in this video, so if you don't want to be spoiled, I mean, it came out a long time ago, but FYI, there will be spoilers. Surprisingly, I managed to not know the twist in Scream, and so I was genuinely surprised when we found out that Billy and what's his name, the other kid, were the masterminds behind all of the killing. I went through most of the movie kind of thinking maybe it was her dad. Clearly that was not correct, but I think we were supposed to think that. I mean, they were sort of trying to set him up as their fall guy, so it makes sense. This was a lot of fun to watch. It was fun, it was funny, it was extremely self-aware. It made a lot of kind of jokes at its own expense, and I know from hearing other people talk about it that this was the first horror film to really do something like that. We've seen it happen in a lot of other movies since then, but Scream sort of originated this kind of tongue-in-cheek, self-referential approach to horror. There are so many horror movie references throughout it, which is interesting. We literally see scenes of horror movies like Halloween, which by the way was on my list for last year to see for the first time, so I'm glad I had already seen it by the time I watched this one. It's also playing around with some of the tropes of slasher films, and we even get these explicit monologues explaining the rules of horror movies, which of course this movie chooses to break, such as the idea that anybody who has sex is going to get killed, only a virgin can survive the slasher. And I like the fact that Sydney, our heroine, does have sex and still survives. So it's clearly pushing back on some of the moralizing ideas of earlier films in this subgenre. One thing that really stood out to me at the beginning when Drew Barrymore's character had died and Sydney's dad is going off for the weekend for business is, I was like, what parent wouldn't just cancel their business trip after something like this happened and stay home? And you know what's interesting about it is I mentioned that this was really about the fears and concerns of Gen X. And one way that I think that that is probably true is Gen X was really the generation of latchkey kids. Now this moves into some of us elder millennials, some of my cohort of people were also this, but there was a lot of that parental absenteeism, I suppose, and maybe feelings of abandonment. And I think you kind of see that here with this teen girl whose mom has abandoned her. Her dad is just continuing to go off somewhere supposedly for his business trip even after this horrific murder has happened. And I think that that is maybe playing into some of those concerns. The other thing that's really interesting about this movie is that it's drawing on these fears of violent media creating killers and sort of the gamification of violence, teenagers being immune to violence. I watched this with my spouse, and one thing that he pointed out is that this film came out a couple of years before Columbine happened. And, you know, I remember being in school when that happened. And what's interesting is that teenagers at that time didn't make it a big joke like they sort of do in the movie. It was taken really seriously, it hit really hard. So it does sort of beg the question of how much validity there is to this idea that violent video games, violent media, which is kind of what was in the atmosphere, especially back in the 90s when this movie was made, actually does create this sort of callousness to teenagers without there already being other issues present. What is wild is that one of the killers at the end literally is literally killed by a TV, which is just wild to me. You know, like it had been playing this horror movie and she drops the TV on his head and he's kind of like smashed and electrocuted by the TV. Again, like very much tongue-in-cheek dark humor, but also linking into this theme of, oh my God, violent television is killing us, or television is like killing our children, which is just like a very sort of Gen X generational thing to talk about. I also noticed there's a lot of pop psychology references throughout the film, and none of them are taken very seriously, right? We have Sydney saying things like, I'm dealing with the post-traumatic stress of this thing, and I can't just hang out in the grief cycle. And then our, you know, one of our villains, Billy the boyfriend, being like, you know, maternal abandonment can create a lot of problems. It's like all of these like pop psychology keywords sort of tossed out there, but like not very well, which is a little bit entertaining. I don't know, I had a really good time with this. I think it's smart, I think it's interesting. I think it is intentionally pushing back on some of the more questionable or harmful aspects of the traditional approach to the slasher genre, and I liked it quite a lot. I think this was a great start to my movie watching experience, and I am so glad that I went into it not knowing, because that reveal moment of who the actual killers were, I was like, no. So it was fun, I had a good time, and I will be back once I have seen Jennifer's Body. Hello, today is the first day of New York Comic Con, but before I head out for that, I wanted to briefly talk about the movie I watched last night, Jennifer's Body. This was such an interesting film, and also funny, darkly funny. I thought the performances from Megan Fox and Amanda Seyfried were incredible in this, and wow, the queerness is very real in this movie. So people were definitely not wrong. There is a lot of commentary on bisexual identity, queer identity in this film, and it's fascinating. I had a really good time with it, but also when I finished it, it made me want to go and seek out commentary on the film. I haven't done it yet because I've been busy getting ready for Comic-Con and because I wanted to record my reactions first. But I would be really interested to see thought pieces written on this film, because from what I've seen, it didn't do great when it first came out and then sort of gained a cult following and got rediscovered as a sort of lost feminist classic later on. As always, there will be spoilers for the film, so just a heads up. But the basic premise of this is that our two main characters are best friends, have been since kindergarten. They have this really interesting relationship where obviously there is a lot of sexual tension between the two of them, even though supposedly they're straight. Amanda Seyfried has a boyfriend. Megan Fox, playing Jennifer, has boys who are always into her. So they go out one night, and through a series of events, Jennifer ends up getting accidentally sacrificed as a virgin, except because she's not a virgin, which I thought the way that was played was pretty funny, to be honest, even though it's really violent. Like, that whole thing was kind of funny. But because she's not a virgin, she instead gets possessed by a demon that survives by eating people, and mostly boys. So basically Amanda's character, Needy, which, such an odd character name choice for that, I've got to say. Needy and Jennifer, like, I don't know. It's interesting because she is, in a sense, kind of clingy, at least at the beginning part of the movie, and kind of seeing her full character arc through the film is fascinating. But Needy is kind of in love with her best friend, who ends up becoming demon possessed, and she figures out that she's the one who has been killing all of these boys in gruesome, horrifying ways. And like, that is the plot of the film, and it's excellent. It made me laugh at times. It also does some really interesting things. Like the fact that there's this sex scene played side by side where we have Needy having sex with her boyfriend for the first time, and because of some kind of a psychic connection that she has with Jennifer, during that time is aware that Jennifer is making out with and then killing a victim. And just the fact that, I mean, it's played as like a horror thing, but I think the key thing of that scene is Needy's having sex with her boyfriend, staring up at the ceiling, thinking of her best friend. I'm like, I mean, you know. There's also a honestly pretty hot makeout scene between the two of them before Needy is like, wait, what's happening? You're killing people. What are you doing? But yeah, there's like so much between the two of them. And even the scene where Needy finally kills her, I had to laugh. I had to laugh because she like pulls out a box cutter and is like, it's from Home Depot. And Jennifer is like, oh my god, Needy, are all your other weapons from Home Depot too? You're so butch. Just like, I mean, she's like, listen, this movie was like really, really great. I will say there were definitely some things that did not age well. The R word is used several times throughout the film. The way that they deal with a Muslim character is also kind of gross. This did come out in 2009, and this was the way people were talking at the time. It wasn't okay then, but it really doesn't age well now. So there are a few of those things, heads up going in. But overall, I really loved this movie. It's one that I would watch again. I thought it was funny and insightful and interesting, and the chemistry between our two lead actresses was excellent. I loved the character arc for Needy by the end of the movie. Like, perfection. Yeah, I mean, this is like lesbian revenge horror, I guess. I don't know. It's great. I feel like over time I'll probably have more thoughts on this movie. As I said, I'd like to go and read some commentary on it from people who have spent some time analyzing the film, because I think there's definitely fodder for that. I will say I think it's funny because from the very beginning I kind of guessed a little bit of what was going on. I didn't go into this knowing very much. I saw the preview, but I didn't know that much about it. But the very first time that we meet this band, right? Because the whole way that she gets possessed is because she's sacrificed by an indie rock band that wants to get famous by sacrificing a virgin. And so the very first time that the lead singer introduces himself as Nikolai, I was like, you're the dude, huh? You're gonna do something that's gonna turn her into a monster. And lo and behold, that was in fact correct. So yeah, it's great. It's fun and smart and funny, and clearly was a little bit ahead of its time. It's interesting looking back because this came out in 2009, which was the year I met my husband, And certainly neither of us would have been seeing it at that point in our lives with where we were at. I still didn't realize I was bisexual, although if I had seen this movie at that point in my life, I probably would have. That's not how it happened, but yeah, I can definitely see why, especially coming out of this, Megan Fox has become considered by some people sort of a bisexual icon. I can see why apparently this film ended up being a big part of a lot of people's journey to recognizing their own queerness and coming out. Totally get that. I mean, honestly, that make-out scene, man, like, if you didn't know you were queer before watching it, you would probably know by the end of it, so just saying. I think that's about all I have to say at this point on Jennifer's Body, but so far so good. I have loved both of the first two movies that I picked, which is excellent. I'm always happy when I do a good job choosing movies for myself. Both of them are films that I would for sure rewatch, so yay. For anybody in the US who has Amazon Prime, at least right now, Jennifer's Body is free to watch there. I don't know if it always is or if it's just this month, but heads up. I watched Chloe last night and I definitely have some thoughts. It's such an interesting film, and again, as with the other ones, we're definitely going to talk spoilers, especially with this movie, because I don't know how you discuss it without talking spoilers. So for anyone who's not aware, Chloe is billed as an erotic thriller. Amanda Seyfried's character plays basically a high-end escort. Meanwhile, Julianne Moore is a middle-aged woman playing the wife of Liam Neeson. Her teenage son has a girlfriend and is about to graduate from high school. She kind of feels like she's fading into the background, and she thinks that her husband might be cheating on her because he flirts with a lot of young women, including some of his students. So she ends up hiring this girl, Chloe, to kind of come on to her husband and see what he does. And that ends up leading to a sexual relationship developing between the two women. Now, the performances in this film were excellent. I mean, of course, you have an incredible cast. Julianne Moore, wow, did an amazing job in this role. And I find myself, the older I get, more and more drawn to stories like this, stories about middle-aged women who feel like they are aging, like their role in the world is changing and they're not sure who they are anymore. They feel maybe invisible. It's something that I've seen in a few different places lately, and I think there's a reason that these stories have resonance. There's probably something to the fact that, especially in their 40s and 50s, and especially certainly in Hollywood, women age and become less the center of attention. Men age and often still get the same amount of attention, at least in that middle part of life. And you know, everybody has things they're dealing with, but in this case, we have this woman who feels like she's getting old, like she doesn't know who she is anymore. She doesn't know how to be a mother to a son who is almost grown. She's in a marriage that doesn't have the passion that it had when she was young. This film is, especially for the time that it came out in 2010, certainly transgressive in being a mainstream film with big actors that was portraying a sexual relationship between two women. And in fact, it is quite explicitly portrayed. We do have a sex scene between these two women, which again, I think we're starting to see a little bit more of that happening in film, but for when it was coming out, that was transgressive, but it wasn't willing to quite go far enough. And I have a lot of thoughts about the choices made with the ending of this film, because yeah, the ending of this film is a choice. Amanda Seyfried is a bisexual who becomes obsessed with Julianne Moore. So there's a lot of things about the way that this is all handled that I'm side-eyeing pretty hard. Number one, we have the fact that the bisexual girl really only serves the purpose of awakening our supposedly straight woman to having a better marriage again with her husband. We literally have the bury your gays trope where she, at the end of the film, lets go and falls to her death because I guess she has now served her purpose for the movie. She's been kissed by this woman she loves, and obviously because she's a sex worker and insane because she's a bisexual, that was the only purpose of her life. So there's a lot of problems with this, right? Number one, the portrayal of sex work and people who engage in sex work is kind of a problem. She's portrayed as being mentally unstable. She is portrayed as being so desperate for love and affection and intimacy as to become incredibly possessive to a disturbing extent of this woman that she has apparently fallen for, and also has so little of value in her life that, you know, like if she can't have this woman, she's gonna fall to her death. So like, not great representation of sex workers, not great representation of bisexuality. And then on the flip side of it, we have Julianne Moore, where she kind of says towards the end of the thing, like, I'm sorry I misled you. I only ever had feelings for my husband. And I'm like, that is some bullshit. Like, I'm sorry, but that is some bullshit. Like, clearly she also had feelings for this young woman. And what's annoying about the way that this film chooses to end is that instead of doing what I think could have potentially been more interesting in exploring the way that this has awakened her to a fuller understanding of who she is, of her own sexuality, like this was all just centered on her own obsessive tendencies and insecurities to do with her husband and nothing to do with the fact that she was into being with this woman. Yeah. Excellently acted, really well done for the most part, but I did not love the ending. And then also I have questions about the fact that the final scene, right? The final scene is her later looking, you know, younger and prettier and whatever, and turning around, and we see this like hair stick that Chloe throughout the film had been trying to give to her as kind of a symbol of her affection. We see it in her hair. So what does that mean? Does it mean, oh, well, I'm still just carrying this experience with me and that's helping me now be a better wife to my husband? Does it mean that Chloe really did mean something to her? I don't know. Like, I have a lot of questions about that ending scene and what the intent of it was, maybe to raise some questions about like uncertainty. I don't know. This movie was a trip though. I will say I guessed pretty early on the twist, which is that as Chloe is telling all of these elaborate stories about meeting up with her husband and having sex with her husband, I was like, I bet she's lying. I bet none of this ever happened and she's just saying it because she's trying to seduce the wife. The only way Julianne Moore's character is going to feel okay about being attracted to this young woman is thinking her husband's having an affair or something like that. And I was totally right. There's a moment where she invites them both to the same place. Liam Neeson's character turns and looks at her and is like, I don't know who this girl is. And clearly he's never seen her before in his life. So I guessed that that was going to be the twist pretty early on, but I think even given that, it was really interesting to watch the story unfold. Again, I mean, the acting is incredible. The tension between the two of them is incredible. Amanda Seyfried's performance as Chloe was excellent, even if I have some serious questions about the choices that they made with the ending of the film. It's a really interesting one. You know, of course, it wouldn't be a horror thriller if they had done this, but part of me is like, okay, maybe the healthy ending for this would have been them deciding that they can just like have a more polyamorous relationship and be more open and vulnerable with each other. I don't know. It was an interesting film. If you've seen it, if you have thoughts on it, please leave them in the comments down below because that ending was something. 2 movies left to go. I will be back once I have seen Midsommar. I am so curious about this one, but also nervous. I feel like of the 5 that I've chosen, this is the one that has the potential to be the most genuinely disturbing from what I hear. So we'll see how I get on with it. I watched Midsommar. It has been a couple of days. I meant to talk about it on Friday and then one of our kids got sick, so you know, it's been a time, and now I'm slightly under the weather, probably from taking care of my child, but you know, part of parenthood. This is what happens. So Midsommar, wow. It was very interesting. I liked it, but also it is not for the faint of heart. I feel like this is probably the most intense thing that I've seen, but it's also just so smart and brainy and brilliantly executed, and there's so much to unpack. I mean, you could do a whole video just on this movie alone. I don't think I'm going to do it justice in this video, but it is one that I could see myself wanting to rewatch in the future just to kind of further unpack all of the things. So what is Midsommar? Midsommar is weird, very violent and gruesome at times, but also beautiful, and our main character is going through the cycle of grief in this film, which is interesting. There are so many layers to unpack in what this movie is doing thematically, in the way that it uses its visual medium for storytelling, some of which are obvious, some of which are not. It is definitely the kind of movie that rewards attention to detail. The closer you pay attention throughout the film, even to just things in the background, things on the set, especially artwork in various shots, the richer I think your experience with this film is going to be. I had a lot of fun trying to put some of that stuff together. I did notice some of the artwork even on the apartment walls early on in the film that is giving you some hints and clues, some of what is later to come. The artwork plays a really big role in telling you what's happening without using words. And there are quite a number of things in this film that are never really spelled out for you as the viewer. You have to kind of put the pieces together. I don't think that that is what everybody wants from their horror viewing experience. I think there are people who want to just sort of be along for the ride and don't want to have to engage too deeply with it. But Midsommar is not really one of those movies. It is, I mean, you could do that, but I feel like if you do, you're going to be missing a lot of it. And it is, again, something that really rewards that close attention to detail. In terms of plot, this follows a group of graduate students who are going to Sweden over the summer. One of their cohort has invited them back to his small town / commune where he was raised to participate in their midsummer festival that happens once every 90 years. And it gets very brutal and very gruesome. Florence Pugh puts on an excellent performance in this film. She is really the main character of the movie, and her story is so interesting because she begins the story dealing with the death of her entire family at the hands of her bipolar sister, which is pretty disturbing. And this movie is her going through the cycle of grief, having a really shitty boyfriend who doesn't give her space to truly grieve, where she is holding in a lot of her grief. We see her for the first part of the movie always going and crying and screaming in bathrooms because she doesn't want to do it publicly. And then finally, by the end of the movie, coming to a place where she experiences catharsis, where she's able to scream and cry with a group of other women who mirror that grief back at her. And like the final shot of her in this film smiling like as people are dying, and like oh my gosh, it is quite an ending shot. But I think the thing is she she has finally moved through the full cycle of grief, finally released all of this anger and grief and gone through that process. And, you know, for somebody left without a family and with really crappy friends and a shitty boyfriend, has now been embraced by this family who will hold her and grieve with her. And yes, she might have to commit suicide when she's 72, but, you know, that's a long way off. Yeah. Okay, this movie is trippy because there are some really out there disturbing things in it. This is one where my husband and I watched it together, and 2 days later we were still talking about it. I went and read some articles on it, and I was very pleased to see how much of what was going on there I picked up on my first watch through. But one thing that I found really fascinating about Midsommar is that some of the most disturbing elements of the movie, disturbing, gruesome things that happen, are actually based on Norse history. They are things that exist in poems from this region of the world and ancient literature and like there's debate over how much they actually happened or when they happened, but it's like taking those horrifying things and moving them into the present day. But what makes it so interesting, again, I'm talking about like this movie has layers. I just, maybe one day I need to do like a full video on it. But what makes this film so interesting is the choice to have at least two, I think maybe more than at least two of the graduate students who go on this trip, including the boyfriend, are anthropologists, and they want to do research on this place that they are in. But like, it's so interesting because there's this disconnect between the fact that, okay, yeah, they're doing these cultural practices that you're intellectually trying to figure out without fully realizing the danger that it puts you in your more immediate circumstances. There are some weird ritual things in this movie. I was like the sex ritual, I was like, oh my god, like this is so awkward and so weird. Yeah, but things like the suicide of older people, that is based in historical reality, and the title that they use in the film is the title that was used historically for this kind of pagan ritual of death. Similarly, we see in a very disturbing scene, one of the bodies of the people who was killed kind of taken apart. It is quite grotesque and disturbing, but apparently it is also based on a torture tactic that was maybe possibly used. It is mentioned in a couple of places in ancient poems, like epic poems from this part of the world. Experts debate on whether it was actually used in reality, but you see it in the film. Apparently, my husband also said that it is something that happens in one of the Assassin's Creed video games, so that is another place that people might know it from. Like, what else to say about this? I don't know. This, I feel like, is a movie that probably deserves its entire own video breaking down the meaning of what's going on and all of the subtext. There's art in the apartment early on. There's art in the different buildings that they're in while they're in this commune that have meaning for what the film is trying to do. Also, one thing that I noticed, and again, speaking to the fact that this is a film that rewards close attention to detail, is towards the beginning of the film, when they are first arriving at the property, one of the Americans sees a group of kids and is like, oh, there's some kids, what are they playing? And their host says, oh, they're playing Skin the Fool. And so towards the end of the film, when they are bringing out all of the people that are going to be sacrificed in a fire for this ritual, they bring out this guy who's wearing a fool's cap, and it is in fact his skin. So, you know, that is not explained on camera. You see it, and if you were paying close enough attention early in the movie to notice what was said in the seemingly throwaway line about the game the children are playing and connect it to this guy at the end, then you're like, oh, okay. But you're never told what happened to him. And I guess what's really interesting about this too is that a lot of the deaths happen off screen, but they're still horrifying. At the same time, the pacing of the movie is this strange one where it goes from grotesque horror to these really lovely, quiet moments of interpersonal interaction, or just like enjoying the countryside, or whatever the case may be. And then it'll cut right back to something gruesome or something that reminds you that you're watching a horror film. The cinematography in this is also really interesting. They make a lot of use of mirrors and reflections. So there are shots where there are characters that you only see in a mirror, you only see in a reflection. And I feel like there's probably meaning to some of those points. I don't know, there's a lot. There's so much detail. This is like, I feel like this is the dream of a nerdy film buff, right? Like, I can see why this was such a popular film, because it invites that kind of nerdiness and attention to detail and breaking down all of the things that they did. And I really liked it. It was a lot. There were a few moments where I kind of looked away, where I was like, wow, like it really goes hard when it's going hard, and does not flinch away from depicting gore and horrific things. So I would definitely say this is one that's probably not for the faint of heart. If, you know, you get queasy at stuff like this may not be for you. But as grotesque as it was at times, I quite liked it as a film. I thought it was really smart. I thought it was really well acted, well crafted, and it's got some pretty interesting things to say thematically. Again, this is one where I just don't feel like I'm doing it justice, even though I've been talking about it for a while. There are a lot of articles written on this, on like understanding the ending of it, what it all means, what are the things that have done. There's been a lot that's been written about it. I know, because I was like Googling Midsommar and like commentary people had on it after I finished watching it, because it's that kind of movie. It is definitely one that you want to watch with other people and talk about. And I will say, for me, this is not true of everyone, but at least for me, when I'm approaching a film like this from that kind of brainy space of I am looking to pinpoint and dissect and pay attention to detail, it gives me a little bit of an emotional buffer, I think, from some of the more horrific things that are going on. I mean, I'm still engaged emotionally, but it doesn't feel as immediate, and so I think that worked out really well for me in this film. I could go on, but I am going to stop there, and I will be back once I have seen the final film for this project, and then we will wrap things up. I watched Bodies, 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 so let's talk about it. I'm really glad that I ended with Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. I feel like this was the perfect movie to end it on. It's definitely a slasher horror comedy, and it feels in many ways like an iconic Gen Z slasher film in the way that Scream was an iconic slasher film for Gen X. I've got to say, I laughed a lot in this movie because the characters are kind of the epitome of chronically online, and I think as a content creator myself who is very deeply in that world, it was quite entertaining. The way that they integrated so many things about like allyship and mental health, but not in substantive ways, in more performative ways. If we think of teen slasher films as playing to the concerns and fears of a generation, Bodies, Bodies, Bodies is interesting because, to me, the two big themes that we come away with are, number one, this feeling of the need to be perfect or to perform what is expected, being so online all the time. I can't imagine growing up in digital culture in the way that Gen Z and Gen Alpha, my own kids, are, because it's really so different. Facebook wasn't a thing until I was in college, and so I didn't grow up as a teenager in that life, and it's just such a different world now. The ending to this movie, oh my God, was perfection. Perfection, and I was dying. Spoilers for the end of Bodies, 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 but the fact that all of the deaths in the movie started with them assuming that there was a killer on the loose when there wasn't, when a guy trying to do a trick for a TikTok video accidentally slashed his own neck. I'm like, yes, that is, I feel like, sort of the epitome of this chronically online thing, the idea that a whole slasher thing would begin just because somebody did some stupid shit for a video. This was just so good. Honestly, I think it deserves a lot more attention than it seems to be getting. This film was excellent. It was so smart. And going back to this question of what are the fears and concerns of the generation that are being explored in the film, I think part of it is this feeling of a need to be perfect performatively in these different ways that are expected of us. But I think the other thing that this really taps into is the question of whether we can trust people, whether we can trust our friends, trust the people close to us, or whether they're just friends with us on the surface and doing it for clout reasons or for money or for other reasons. I think that was a really interesting thing that's explored here. You know, we get it in some silly ways, like where we find out that one girl listens to the podcast of another girl that is supposedly her friend. We get this with concern about whether a character had cheated on her girlfriend. I think we also even get it in some of these questions about how do you actually know these people? How long have you known them? What's the difference between people that you've known from childhood versus some 40-year-old dude that you met on Tinder 2 weeks ago, right? And I think that question of trustworthiness and how we figure out who we can really be vulnerable and emotionally intimate with is a big question and concern of the film. And I think it makes sense that that is perhaps a real difficulty for Gen Z because of this chronically online state. There are definitely some parallels to Scream. I talk about earlier in this video that watching Scream, they used a lot of pop psychology terminology that was being thrown around at the time, but again, with no real depth or understanding of what it means. And you have the same thing happening here. We have talk of gaslighting, body dysmorphia, PTSD, trauma, and it's often handled so poorly with so little depth, so little understanding, kind of carelessly, but I think that carelessness is intentional. These have become psychology terms that are sort of in the ether on TikTok that people are vaguely familiar with, but don't really have the full understanding or grounding to know what the hell they're talking about. And I think you really see that with the characters here. There were just so many great lines in this movie, so many quote-worthy lines and hilarious moments. Throughout the film, we have this character going on about how some of these friends come from really wealthy families and how she didn't. And then around the climax of the film, when all the dirt is coming out, everyone's kind of spilling their true, real thoughts and the honesty is coming to the forefront, we have this moment where she's told by another character, "You love your rags to riches story, but it's not even true. Your parents are upper middle class." And she says, "No, they're not." And the other character says, "Yes, they are. They teach at a university." Her response is, "It's public." I just, like, oh my God, this movie is hilarious and honestly perfectly nails so much of this chronically online culture. And you know, I'm a part of it, I think, because of what I do as a job in a way that a lot of other older millennials like myself are not, but I didn't grow up with it in the same way, and I do think that that has an impact. Anyway, this film was fantastic. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I got such a kick out of it, and I would definitely watch this one again. If it hasn't already been on your radar, I would recommend it. I think it's such a great film and well worth a watch. And that brings us to the end of my horror project for 2022. Overall, I think it went really well. I enjoyed all of the films that I picked out, which is exciting. That doesn't always happen, but they were all hits for me. They're very different from each other, but I think my reading of horror books this month and my watching of these horror films has helped me to kind of crystallize what it is that I enjoy and appreciate in the horror genre. And because I am relatively new to it, I think that is useful information for me to have. I really enjoy over-the-top horror comedies or slashers, things that are just so over the top they're almost campy or not realistic at all. But I also really enjoy movies that can be dissected and unpacked for their thematic content or for the filmmaking choices that they made. That's part of what I loved about Midsommar so much, is the attention to detail in that film is incredible. And I love a film like Jennifer's Body for its subversive, pointed takedown of misogyny and the way that queer women tend to be treated. I really enjoyed all of the films that I watched. I think the one that I have the most quibbles with in terms of the choices that were made for the storytelling is obviously Chloe. That one I have a lot of questions about how they chose to handle the ending. That said, I thought the acting was phenomenal and I still had a really good time watching that movie. So the 2022 challenge is complete and I think I did a fantastic job selecting the films for this year. I will be back doing this again in 2023, and if you have any suggestions of horror films that you think that I should watch or things that you think should be on my radar, feel free to leave them in the comments down below. If you enjoyed following along on this project, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you want to see more of my content discussing media. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you next time.